Welcome to the Select Star Podcast, your resource for innovative technology, developer topics, and more. Here's your host, Margot McCabe from the HarperDB team.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Select Star Podcast hosted by HarperDB. Thanks again for tuning in. Today, we have a guest who I will let introduce himself in a minute here. His name is Itiel Shwartz. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. But thank you so much for joining us today. I'm excited to chat with you.
Thank you. You pronounce it perfectly. And I'm also super excited joining the podcast.
Awesome. And where are you calling in from today?
Israel. I'm currently at Tel Aviv at the office. So yeah.
Okay. Awesome. I've never been to that part of the world, but it's definitely on my list.
It's hot and like really good weather now. So
Yeah.
feel free.
Awesome. Well, so yeah, before we kind of jump into some of our topics for today, which are a little bit around DevOps, Kubernetes, things like that, would love to just hear a bit about you, your background, journey to becoming a CTO, kind of what you're working on now.
Sure. I'll be happy to share. So my name, like I said, is Itiel. I'm the CTO and co-founder of Komodor. We are a startup that are building a platform to enable developers and DevOps to troubleshoot or to understand and to control their Kubernetes much easier. And basically, in my background, I used to work for like very large enterprises such as eBay. And then like slowly, like I started at eBay, and then I joined an Israeli startup named Forter, which were around like 50 people. And then the company really grew and became successful. So I wanted to join something smaller. So I joined the Rookout, which is a startup designed to help developers to debug their code much faster in production. I was the first developer there. And obviously, I learned a lot, and I did a lot of like backend, front-end, ops, sales, marketing, pretty much everything. And after 2 years there, I really felt that there is a real pain in Kubernetes. It was two years ago, and maybe a bit more. I felt that Kubernetes is gaining a lot of popularity on one hand, but on the other hand, like no one really understands how to like investigate it, control it, troubleshoot it. And I felt there's like a real pain that I felt like first-handed. And I teamed up with Ben Ofiri and my partner from Google at the time. And we started Komodor. And like 2 years to that decision, I can say that we help like dozens of companies. And our product really simplifies the flow of like allowing you to understand what is happening in your Kubernetes cluster, and specifically around like issues and problems.
That's awesome. That's really interesting. I think a lot of companies are created out of experience, like what you said, where you worked in the industry and you saw the need or a gap for something, and I'm sure you searched around and couldn't find something to fill the gap that Commodore does. So then you kind of have to make that leap of, okay, are we really going to split out and do this on our own? And I'm sure that's a little bit scary, but it's probably really cool to see how far you guys have come and that you already have so many companies working with you and things like that.
Yeah. Can you repeat it again? Sorry.
Oh, I was just saying, so it's really interesting. A lot of startup founders that I chat with, it seems like you know, it's maybe a little scary to take the plunge and quit whatever your full-time job is to start something like this, but it's probably really rewarding to see that you already have so many customers using it and to see that Komodor is helping so many people.
Yeah, I will say like two things. Like the first one, it is scary. Maybe even three things. Like the first one is it is scary, but like I'll be honest, ever since like doing the degree in like computer science, I really felt that, I like creating things, building things. And like throughout my career, I just waited for like the right opportunity to start my own venture. So it is something I like really wanted myself. And also like the nice thing about like working on something you felt the personal pain, that it is a problem. Like I don't need anyone else, like as a domain expert or something like that, because I really know Kubernetes. And because I knew that Kubernetes is going to take off, it was clear for me that the pain and the need is real. So it's like all we need to do is like to deliver a promise that can really help solving that pain and so on. But in a high level, I can say that the fact that I come from the industry, that I know Kubernetes really well, and that I really thought that Kubernetes is going to take off, really helped me, like, you know, reduce the uncertainty and the scary part of like jumping in and starting my own venture.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And so with where Komodor is now, are there, when you're speaking with developers or speaking with companies, are there any specific like pain points or problems that they are facing that make it really obvious that a tool like Komodor might be helpful?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the number one thing, and it's like cross industries, cross companies, is like the lack of knowledge and expertise. Komodor basically simplifies all of the troubleshooting flow and helping you understand where the issue lies, what is the root cause, how did the system change over time, how to remediate it. I think that Kubernetes is gaining a lot of popularity, and the level of expertise and knowledge people have around Kubernetes is still quite fresh. It is still like a new technology. It's not like, I don't know, like Python or like Linux that exists for dozens of years. Like Kubernetes is, I think it had like its 8th birthday just now, and it really became popular like 2 years ago, 3 years ago. So we're still in the phase where a lot of companies are migrating to Kubernetes, but most of the organization, if not all of the organization, simply doesn't know how to operate it like professionally. So we are at the state that every company is trying to be a Kubernetes company, but they are lacking the manpower and resources to do so. And I think like this is something we see cross industry as like one problem. And the second part is we see the shift left movement, basically developers trying to take more and more ops responsibilities. And this in terms, like I said, there's like a big knowledge gap even for like operation people. But when developers are trying to figure out what is happening with their code, with their service in production, we see that problem basically like multiply itself, because no one in the organization really knows what is happening. The developers are usually less experienced than the ops people, but somehow they are responsible to troubleshoot and to understand. So we see a lot of different like pain when it comes to issues and problems in troubleshooting Kubernetes environments.
Right. Yeah, and it's an interesting point you make because Kubernetes has picked up a lot in popularity, and I'm starting to see so many tutorials about it and blogging mediums and platforms specifically dedicated to Kubernetes. But I think that the knowledge and expertise with folks and with developers in companies has not caught up yet. So it's like it's gaining a lot of traction really quickly, but now we still don't have this massive group of people like coming out of coding school or coming out of jobs where that's their specific expertise. Maybe we'll see that more in 5 or 10 years, but that's really interesting, an interesting point that you make. So I can see why Komodor is making a lot of traction pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think like one more thing about Kubernetes that makes it like super interesting, it is really led by the community. And that means that Kubernetes itself is moving really fast. Like even if you do nothing, like just because Kubernetes, the ecosystem is moving so fast, like you are always one step behind. There are new versions of Kubernetes, new CRDs, new Helm charts that you must install, new best practices. So everything is like moving in super high speed, which, for me, it's super fun. But for organizations trying to keep their head above the water, it might be like hard keeping track sometimes. So it is like a bit problematic in a lot of the companies that we're seeing, simply like staying on top everything that is happening.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, congratulations for the success that you've found so far by building this company. I think that it's really interesting, and I'm sure people listening will be interested to check it out because, I think most developers or development teams have at least someone that's touching on Kubernetes at some point. So yeah, that's a really great success that you've had. So I'd love to learn a little bit about GitOps. So if people listening aren't familiar, can you sort of help describe like the main benefits and challenges of GitOps?
Yeah, sure. So GitOps is becoming increasingly popular. Basically, it means that Git should serve as the source of truth for your system versions. And that means that in order to change the system in production, I need to change, first of all, like the file or files in my GitHub. And in like some magical way, it will be synced between the GitHub and the system in production. I think GitOps really, like it is taking off tremendously. I think mainly due to like Argo CD, which is an amazing project by Intuit that allows you to do it quite easily. And before GitOps, like there wasn't like one place to have your versions and versions history. And like, in the old days, you went into the server, you did like SSH, and then maybe you downloaded the new version, and that's it. Like this is how you deploy to production. And the new mentality is Git should serve as like the source of truth, and you should update Git and then sync it up with the production clusters. So that is like GitOps, and that's the promise, and it is gaining a lot of popularity.
Interesting. And so with the popularity that it's gaining, and as you said, it's really helping a lot of organizations. It's an important area to focus on. Are there also challenges around GitOps, or if a company, for example, is like looking to implement some of these strategies, are there any things to watch out for?
I think first of all is like choosing the right set of tools, and I think Argo is like a great tool to do it. Like there's also Flux by Weave that is like a really popular tool. So first of all is like choosing the right tool. I think when you like go to implement GitOps, the one thing that like is never clear and you need to think about it in advance is what do I do in the unhappy flow? Like if everything works perfectly, then everything is like perfect. You write your code, you change the version in Git, and then Argo deploy it, and everyone is happy. And the question is, how do I test my code in production, and what do I do when those tests or the deploy fail? So let's say that after the deploy, I want to run a set of end-to-end tests, like not unit tests, like a live test on my code. So how do I do the rollout? How do I do the revert? How do I know when things fail? I think that like people like look at GitOps as like one magical tool that will like help solve all of their issues when deploying their code to production. But in reality, it's like one important piece of the chain, which is deploying my code from my laptop to production. So I think like you should treat it as something which is important around the chain, but not the only thing. And I think a lot of people are missing that part.
Yeah, those are some good tips. I think sometimes it seems like maybe teams or companies are a little too eager and jump in or make a shift too quickly. So I think those are some good reminders in terms of be sure that you're looking at your tech stack, the tools that you're implementing, that you're analyzing all of these different factors and making sure it's the best fit, and not just like what someone recommends or not just what the most popular thing is in that moment. So it's a lot easier to change your tech stack up front, but later on, once everything's been implemented, it's obviously much more difficult to rip everything out from the bottom and replace. So, we're always telling companies the same thing, take the time up front to really analyze and make sure you're weighing all your options and doing testing and things like that before kind of jumping in head first. So I know we sort of touched on this already when you were describing what Komodor is doing and why you created it, but do you think that developers should have the same expertise in Kubernetes like the developers in DevOps and platform do, or do you think that it's not really going to be as necessary? Like Should coding
Uh,
schools and things start to be teaching this expertise as just part of a regular curriculum? And should companies be hiring specifically for that?
I'm not sure. Like, to be honest, I'm not sure. Like, I think that there is no one size fit all. Like developers can't know everything. Like in DevOps also can't know everything. So it's a question of like a focus, I would say. And basically to understand like what is the minimum that is super important for the developers to know, and to give them tools so they can operate efficiently, and to maybe like to close the gaps that they have. So I think that the right balance is like dependent per the organization or like per the dev team and methodology. But overall, I think that they do need to know something. I'm not sure if like they need to know everything, because writing code is hard, working with Kubernetes is hard, deploying is hard, like a lot of things are hard, and we do need some sort of focus. I think that like platform teams that allows developers to be much more like efficient, or tools like Komodor, and also tools like also Argo, and I don't know, like Backstage, tools that makes it easier to interact with the production environment, are like really good in like taking the hard part out of basically take the hard part out of understanding and troubleshooting and operating, and makes it a much simpler process. So I think like that's the right direction to go. Like they should know something, but not everything. What do you think?
Yeah,
Margot, like
I think that it's sort of one of those things that, as you said, since Kubernetes is still a little newer, maybe time will tell. But as for now, I think if a company really needs someone that's a Kubernetes expert, I would assume that they would look for a developer that at least has some experience and exposure to it.
yeah,
And then that maybe they would take them in and have, then the company themselves would do the training. Because even if you do hire someone, a developer that says they're a Kubernetes expert, they probably still need to learn it in context of whatever software or tool that they're going to be working on. So I would assume that if a company is really looking for that, that they would bring someone in, and then maybe they'd provide the training or pay for whatever troubleshooting expertise or something that they need. And maybe in the meantime, they outsource that and work with another company.
yeah.
But yeah, I think that it's going to be a little bit more of like, when we do start to see Kubernetes expert on someone's resume, it's probably because they worked at a company for 5 years that like really focused on that and really initiated that training.
Yeah,
But
yeah, makes sense.
yeah, I think a lot of developers I talk to are just starting to learn more about Kubernetes and working with it more, and writing tutorials. Like we work with developers sometimes that have written tutorials on using HarperDB with Kubernetes, for example. And I think sometimes even if they're not using that in their regular full-time position, that they're just curious. Like I talk to a lot of developers that are starting to go to conferences and things just to learn about it, just because they're curious and because they're starting to see how helpful and important it is, and kind of learning on their own on the side. And then of course, that's always going to come in and be helpful at some point, I'm sure, in their career. Like I feel like every developer I talk to is like constantly learning. There's always so many technologies and frameworks and things to learn and work with. And as you said, they can't know everything, but if they take a liking to it and want to take the time to learn it, then that'd be an awesome thing to put on in their expertise column. So, but yeah, I think in the meantime, it's really cool to see the way the community comes together to sort of help each other out. And there's so many resources and places to go for answers and for help.
Yeah, yeah, I completely agree. I completely agree with that.
Yeah. And so I'm also curious, you being a CTO, and as you said, you've worked at a couple other similar roles, building up to what you're doing now. Do you see, like from a higher level, any tips or best practices for dev teams, whether it's like hiring and training or company culture, or even just kind of building and founding a company? Like, what if you could go back and tell your younger self any advice? Is there anything that you think would be really helpful?
Yeah, like I think I'm super biased, but I think that the fact that I worked in two startup prior to starting Komodor, was a really good choice because it allowed me to, first of all, be a bit more relaxed because I already saw how hectic it is to start a new company from scratch. So I think that's one thing that I really recommend people who ask me what's the best way. If possible, working for 2 or 3 years in another startup can give you a whole new perspective on how do startup operate, how do I build the first momentum, how do I build the first product, and so on. And I really think that it affected on how I'm working and how Komodor is built and shaped. So that's one thing. And the second thing is mainly around the first people you hire. I thought that it was important, but I think that it is so clear, now that the company is 2 and something years old, how important were the first hires in the company. So those are the people who are still here, who are teaching everyone, who are the inner advocate, the outer advocates. I think having a strong core team is a must-have. We tried not to compromise at all, and I think we are really seeing the impact of that 2 years down the road. So I think that is another very important thing, and maybe the main thing that I would suggest anyone is to release something as fast as possible. I think that everyone are giving that advice, but in reality it is really hard to release something that that is not I won't even say perfect, but it is very lacking in its capabilities, and you need to push yourself into taking the leap and basically deciding to release as fast as possible. So I think those are maybe 3 tips. Does that make sense, Margot? What do you think?
Yeah, I think that all makes sense and definitely resonates. We're a startup as well. We've been around for a couple more years, but it resonates, and it's interesting you talk about just release as soon as you can, because it's what's that, where do you draw the line? How long are you going to work on a product, and when do you decide? I think a lot of people expect to wake up one day and say, okay, today's the day, it's ready to release. But a lot of people don't feel that, and it's a constantly a project, and there's constantly work for ways for improvement. But I think you have to release and get feedback and do betas and stuff like that in order to understand where to put your resources. And because you could go down one rabbit hole in one path to create all these features, and then have that not even be what the most important features are, for example. So I think that's really good advice, is just don't be afraid to release and get something out there. Also, what you said about the hires and having a good team, our founding team constantly talks about that. Obviously any company is going to have a small amount of turnover, but with startups, if you see a really high rate of turnover, especially early on, I think that's a big red flag. And we've been fortunate, at HarborDB, to have an awesome team, and a lot of our team members have been around since pretty close to the beginning. And I think it creates this really great morale. I'm really proud that I've been at the company as long as I have. And then when we do hire people, I'm super passionate and I believe in it. And it's just, I think it helps to create, that good company culture, because if someone's never worked in a startup before and they're going to be hired in, they might be a little nervous. And it's cool to see that the folks that are there are really passionate and believe in the product or service.
So,
yeah, I think those are all good, important tips.
Yeah. And I think those are the main 3 things that I can recommend.
Yeah. And in the current day, as as CTO, do you and your team have any specific tools, like organization or task management tools, or any processes that you think have been really helpful for staying on track or keeping organized, or tracking the dev roadmap, anything like that?
like we're using like ClickUp, but I don't know, like I think that the important thing that we try to optimize is not really the tools, but more the methodology. We are
Yeah.
like big believers in like move fast and break things. So we release between like 20 to 40 times a day. I think it really gives us a sense of agility, and it really impacts the culture of the company. The fact that like everything is like on a constant change. It was really important for me from day one to have a CI/CD system in place and to make sure everything that goes to master is in production. And if you can, like if you don't work in like something which is highly regulated that might need like approval or changes or things like that, if you can, I think that building the company around like a culture of moving fast is like super important, and it is really hard to do it like after the fact. So it's much easier to build it from the ground up. So I think like that is something that we really optimize, which is important.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's that's always interesting for me to hear. I'm always curious what different teams and companies are following in terms of methodologies and strategies. I for any type of startup, as you said, being fast paced and just constantly releasing, constantly moving, I think is something I hear a lot, that that's important. And as we were saying earlier, that's kind of the best way to figure out, like trial and error is to figure out what needs to be done, what needs to be changed, what's working. So that's interesting. So yeah, I'm curious sort of what your thoughts are then of what trends you're expecting to see sort of looking ahead, like in the Kubernetes space, in the space you guys are working in. Do you have any sort of expectations or things that you're seeing, that is there going to be a shift? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think that there's like the shift left, right? Like moving more responsibilities to devs and internal dev platforms, such as like Backstage and so on. I think like those are two very big waves that we're seeing that are really gaining like popularity. So I think like that's one thing. And the other, which I'm really curious to see how it's going to unfold, is data on Kubernetes. I think you are also like on that area, but will database like be moved into Kubernetes, stateful application, Postgres, MySQL, Elasticsearch? Is everything going to run on top of Kubernetes? My best guess or like bet is it is going to happen. It's going to be like a huge change, but at the moment we only see like very small amount of that. Like we don't have a lot of companies running their like critical databases on Kubernetes. So it is like one thing that is super interesting to see how it's going to happen. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. We're certainly starting to see a little bit of that, but I think it's more for like testing and side projects and just to see how it works, or for a portion of the data, as you said, maybe not the most critical. But I'm sure we will see more and more of that. And once folks get more comfortable, I don't see why there wouldn't be more of a shift that way. So I think that that prediction makes sense. Well, this has all been really interesting for me. I love learning about Komodor and sort of someone with your expertise in the space, like what you're seeing and why you're filling this gap. I think that's really interesting. Are there any other sort of last thoughts you have before we sign off? Like any other technologies you're excited about that you see coming out? Also, any places that listeners can find you or your team, like if they have questions about Komodor or Kubernetes or anything like that.
I think that like if you're running Kubernetes and you didn't check Komodor yet, like you're missing out. So you can like find us on our website, and also like on Twitter and GitHub. We have like a couple of open source projects. We had like one really successful one around validating YAML files, and we have another really big one coming up in the upcoming few weeks around Helm and like Helm visualization. So I think that's pretty much it. That's pretty much it.
Awesome. Yeah. And I'll be sure to put links to the website and the Twitter and everything in the show notes. Thank you so much, ETL. This has been really great to meet you. And I'd love to keep in touch and kind of follow Komodor and see what you guys are up to. So really appreciate you taking the time to connect.
Okay, amazing. Thanks very much.
Have a great rest of your week.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to Select Star, your resource for innovative technology and developer topics. You can find our episodes in all the usual places: Spotify, Apple, Google, RSS, and YouTube. Don't forget to rate, comment, subscribe, and share. You can learn more about HarperDB at harperdb.io.